There is a transformation so profound, so hidden in plain sight, that most people never recognize it until it is already complete. It is the journey of the empath who has endured the consuming force of the narcissist's shadow and survived. At first glance, it seems like a tale of destruction, the sensitive one crushed beneath the weight of another's unprocessed shame, rage, and emptiness. The empath becomes a silent vessel for what the narcissist refuses to acknowledge. They absorb storms that were never theirs, becoming an emotional wasteland where someone else's unresolved torment finds refuge. For years, perhaps decades, the empath bends under this invisible burden, believing it to be compassion, believing it to be love. But survival has a strange alchemy of its own. When you carry darkness long enough, something in the soul begins to shift. It is not a sudden rebellion. It is not a dramatic explosion of defiance. It is quieter, subtler, and far more unsettling. The empath who once explained themselves endlessly grows silent. The empath who once absorbed every emotional toxin without protest begins to notice the difference between what is theirs and what is foreign. Slowly, the threads of false identity unravel, the borrowed emotions dissolve, the compulsive need to risk. You begins to wither. In its place emerges something no narcissist ever anticipates. A soul that has been tempered by shadow, a presence immune to manipulation, a consciousness that sees through the game before it even begins. This metamorphosis cannot be taught in books or classrooms. It is not achieved by techniques or surface-level affirmations. It is born only in the crucible of suffering, in the descent into that night. See Journey, where every illusion is stripped away. To survive being the dumping ground of another's unconscious mind is to come face to face with annihilation. The empath's identity collapses. The mirror they once held up for everyone else shatters. They stare into their own emptiness, realizing they no longer know who they are. And yet within this chaos a seed waits. A deeper self, untouched by projections, untouched by shame, untouched even by despair. The empath discovers that the very thing meant to destroy them has awakened the indestructible core of their being. This is why the empath who survives does not return as the same person. They emerge as something paradoxical, sensitive yet unbreakable, open yet impenetrable, compassionate yet fiercely discerning. They become what can only be described as a walker of shadows, someone who has seen the darkest currents of the human psyche and has returned with eyes that perceive differently. They no longer confuse love with sacrifice, nor empathy with servitude. They no longer mistake guilt for responsibility, nor silence for peace. They embody a form of strength that does not need to declare itself because it simply is. And this transformation is not private. It cannot be. The empath who survives alters the atmosphere around them. Their presence alone becomes disruptive to unconscious patterns. Manipulation that once thrived in their openness now falters against the wall of their awareness. Those who once used them as containers for unprocessed pain find their tactics failing. Others, still trapped in the same cycles, glimpse in them the possibility of liberation. The survivor becomes a mirror again, but this time not a mirror that reflects illusions, one that reflects truth. And truth for many is unbearable. So the empath becomes both feared and revered. Feared by those who remain in unconsciousness, revered by those who long for freedom. Their very existence becomes proof that it is possible to endure the darkest night and return not broken but remade. Proof that sensitivity is not weakness but the raw material of transformation. Proof that love can exist without chains, without abuse, without sacrifice of the self. The narcissist, in their attempt to consume, became the catalyst for the empath's evolution. What they thought was destruction was in fact initiation. What they imagined was conquest was in fact liberation. The empath emerges as a paradox, deeply human yet carrying a kind of spiritual immunity, fragile in their sensitivity yet unshakable in their wholeness. This is who the empath becomes after absorbing the narcissist's darkness and surviving. A being who no longer mistakes shadows for light, who no longer sacrifices themselves to maintain illusions, who no longer participates in unconscious contracts of pain. They become a presence of clarity, a beacon of boundaries, a living testament to the soul's ability to transmute poison into medicine. They become at last themselves. The empath's survival is never just survival. It is not about simply crawling out of the ruins left behind by the narcissist and declaring, "I made it." No, something far deeper takes place. Survival becomes transformation. What the empath undergoes is not a return to who they once were, but the slow birth of someone entirely new. At the beginning, it does not feel like transformation at all. It feels like suffocation. Imagine carrying the rage, the shame, the emptiness of another human being as though it were your own. For years, perhaps, you mistake it for your responsibility. You believe that to love is to absorb. You think compassion means holding what others cannot bear. And so you do, until one day you no longer know where you end and they begin. But the human soul has limits, and when those limits are crossed, something remarkable begins to stir. It is almost imperceptible at first, like a faint crack of light inside a sealed room. The empath realizes they are drowning in emotions that never belong to them. They recognize the endless explaining, the desperate attempts to be understood, have always fallen on ears that were never listening. What once felt like compassion now feels like enslavement, and so, without drama or rebellion, something quiet shifts. The empath begins to let go. They stop carrying burdens that are not theirs. They stop rushing to every emotional fire as though it were their own home burning down. They stop offering themselves as a landfill for pain that was never theirs to process. This is the moment the empath becomes untouchable, not hardened, not callous, but sovereign. It is a sovereignty born not from defiance, but from clarity. They see the game for what it is. They see manipulation before it even arrives. They recognize projections the moment they are cast, and most devastating of all for those who once fed on their openness, they are no longer available. The narcissist's emergencies no longer find a responder. The narcissist's shadows no longer find a container. The empath's soul, which once acted as a dumping ground, becomes an impenetrable boundary of light. But this transformation is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream vengeance or seek recognition. Its power lies in its silence. In this stillness, the empath discovers an authority they never knew they possessed. The authority to decide what enters their psyche, what remains, and what is rejected. And this authority is what makes them untouchable. For the one who has carried darkness and survived it no longer fears darkness. They have faced it, swallowed it, endured it, and returned with their essence intact. Thus, the empath who once seemed fragile becomes a paradox, softer than ever, yet unbreakable. Their very presence begins to unsettle those who depend on unconscious games. Their very existence forces others to confront the shadows they tried so hard to avoid. What emerges is not just a healed person, but a transformed one whose light has been forged in the very fire meant to destroy it. When the empath survives, what unfolds next is not merely recovery, but a deep recognition of truth. For years they had been entangled in illusions, believing that love meant self-sacrifice, that silence kept the peace, that endurance was virtue. Yet after walking through the crucible of another's darkness, these illusions cannot stand. They dissolve like smoke, leaving the empath staring at life without the veils they once clung to. This stripping away is painful, for it forces the empath to face a terrifying question. If I am not what others have projected onto me, if I am not the container for their pain, then who am I? This question is the beginning of rebirth. The empath, who once defined themselves by the roles they played in others' dramas, begins to sense a self beyond those roles. They discover that their worth does not depend on how much they can endure. Their value is not measured by how well they absorb chaos, nor by how tirelessly they maintain harmony in a world that thrives on conflict. They begin to see that love, true love, is not servitude but presence. It is not about diminishing oneself so another can shine. It is not about shrinking to make space for another's inflated shadow. Love, they realize, is rooted in freedom, and without freedom it is not love at all. This realization changes everything. Where once the empath gave endlessly, they now discern. Where once they said yes out of guilt, they now say no out of wisdom. The boundaries they begin to set are not walls of bitterness but living expressions of truth. Every no they speak becomes a yes to themselves, a yes to life, a yes to authenticity, and with each boundary drawn, they recover fragments of their soul that had been scattered in years of self-denial. The empath also learns to see pain differently. In the past, every wound they encountered felt like a command to heal. Every broken piece of another was an urgent summons. But after surviving the narcissist's abyss, they realize that not all pain can be carried, and not all suffering belongs to them. They learn that compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction, and that true empathy requires recognizing where responsibility ends. In this way, the empath becomes both softer and stronger, soft enough to feel the world deeply, strong enough not to be destroyed by it, and in this balance something extraordinary awakens. The empath's sensitivity, once exploited as weakness, becomes their greatest strength. They begin to perceive currents in others that most cannot detect. They see through masks and falsehoods with startling clarity. Their intuition sharpens, not as a burden, but as guidance. They move through life no longer desperate to be accepted, but anchored in the truth of who they are. And those who encounter them cannot help but feel it. This is someone who has walked through fire and has come back whole. By carrying the narcissist's unprocessed emotions, their shame, their rage, their emptiness, the empath undergoes an immersion in shadow that few ever experience willingly. It is as if the empath becomes a vessel for what another refuses to face, absorbing storms that were never theirs to weather. At first this feels like drowning, like being swallowed whole by a darkness without end. Yet in this descent, something unexpected begins to form. What once felt like suffocation slowly forges a strange resilience, a kind of immunity. The empath begins to develop what might be called shadow literacy, an instinctive fluency in recognizing and navigating the forces that dwell in the hidden corners of the human psyche. Most people, when confronted with manipulation or deceit, are disarmed because they do not see it coming. The empath, however, after enduring the relentless projection of another's unhealed wounds, becomes finely attuned to the subtle shifts of energy, the concealed motives, the unspoken currents that ripple beneath words. They know the taste of guilt that does not belong to them, the weight of anger disguised as righteousness, the hollow flattery masking control. Their body feels it before the mind names it. This is not paranoia, but sensitivity trained in fire. In this way, the empath develops what could be called shadow antibodies. Just as the body, once exposed to an illness, learns to resist it, the empath's soul, after carrying what was never theirs, learns to reject it. They no longer internalize every accusation, every blame, every subtle suggestion that they are not enough. Instead, they hold it up to the light of awareness and see it for what it is, an echo of someone else's inner turmoil. And in that moment of recognition, they are free. This freedom is profound, for it changes the empath's entire relationship to suffering. They no longer see themselves as victims of other people's darkness, nor as saviors destined to carry it. Instead, they see themselves as witnesses, capable of perceiving the depths of shadow without being consumed. Where once they were porous, now they are discerning. They know what belongs to them and what does not. They know that to carry what is not theirs is to betray their own life. And so, paradoxically, the very experience that nearly broke them becomes the source of their strength. Having survived the abyss, they no longer fear it. Having lived with another's chaos inside them, they no longer mistake chaos for love. They can stand in the presence of shadow without collapsing, without fleeing, without absorbing. They meet it with calm, with clarity, with a kind of quiet authority that unsettles those who depend on confusion. This is the gift hidden within their suffering, the capacity to navigate human darkness with eyes open, to walk through deception without being deceived, to remain whole in a world that constantly seeks to fragment. When the empath emerges from the grip of the narcissist's shadow, they step into a realm that most people avoid, the territory of the unseen, the realm of darkness and light intertwined. They become what might be called a shadow walker. This does not mean they are consumed by darkness nor that they glorify it. Instead, they carry within them a rare equilibrium, the ability to move through shadow without losing sight of the light. They have lived inside deception, manipulation, and distortion, and rather than being broken by it, they have learned its language. They now recognize the masks people wear, the tones in a voice that reveal more than the words themselves, the hollow gestures that pretend to be love. Where others see only surfaces, the empath perceives what lies beneath. To walk with the shadow is not the same as becoming it. The empath does not seek revenge or mirror back the cruelty they endured. That would still be bondage. Instead, they transform the shadow into knowledge. They know how it operates, how it hides, how it feeds, and most importantly, how it can no longer control them. This gives them a kind of freedom few ever achieve, the freedom of one who cannot be deceived in the same way twice. Their wounds become sight and their pain becomes discernment, but this transformation comes with solitude. For most people prefer illusions. They are more comfortable with pleasing lies than with piercing truths. The empath, however, cannot unknow what they now know. Their vision cuts through facades too easily. Their presence unsettles those who rely on games and pretense. This can make them seem distant, aloof, even intimidating. Yet this is not detachment born of arrogance, but the stillness of one who has seen too much to be fooled. Their silence is not emptiness, but depth. In this depth, the empath finds a strange kind of power. They no longer move reactively, pulled by guilt or fear of abandonment. They move deliberately, grounded in an inner compass that was forged in fire. They know the taste of entrapment, so they are vigilant with freedom. They know the pull of manipulation, so they are careful with trust. And in this vigilance, they become guardians of their own soul, protectors of their own boundaries, keepers of their own light. To walk with shadow is to embody paradox, gentle yet fierce, open yet guarded, compassionate yet discerning. The empath carries both pain and wisdom, both tenderness and strength. Their survival was not a return to innocence, but the awakening of a deeper consciousness, one that can hold the contradictions of human nature without collapsing under them. And so they move through the world differently now, no longer prey, no longer savior, but witness and guide, one who understands the darkness without being claimed by it. When the empath finally steps out of the long night of the narcissist's shadow, what emerges is not simply survival but transfiguration. They are no longer the same person who once bent themselves into silence, who carried guilt that was never theirs, who mistook endurance for love. They have been undone and remade, broken open and reassembled. What arises is not innocence restored, but wisdom hard-earned. It is the kind of wisdom that cannot be taught in books or borrowed from teachers. It comes only from walking through fire and realizing you are still here, breathing, unburned at the core. This wisdom carries a quiet authority. The empath no longer seeks validation from those who cannot give it. They no longer beg for love in places that only echo with emptiness. They no longer mistake sacrifice for intimacy. Instead, they understand the sacred balance of giving and receiving, of self and other, of love and freedom. They know now that to lose oneself in another is not devotion but self-abandonment, and so their love, once tangled with fear and need, becomes purer, freer, unburdened by illusion. This transformation radiates outward. People can feel it in their presence. There is a calm in the way they move, a depth in the way they listen, a strength in the way they say no without hesitation. They no longer explain themselves endlessly, no longer rush to prove their worth, no longer tolerate the erosion of their spirit. Their boundaries are not weapons but living truths, and they guard them with dignity. In this way, the empath becomes both a refuge and a refuge for those who come in honesty, a mirror for those who still hide behind masks. But perhaps the most remarkable change is inward. The empath learns to turn their sensitivity toward themselves. They begin to listen to the subtle signals of their own body, the quiet urgings of their own intuition, the forgotten needs of their own heart. What they once gave away so freely to others, patience, compassion, understanding, they now extend to themselves. And in doing so, they heal the wound that made them vulnerable in the first place, the belief that they were unworthy of their own care. What was once weakness becomes strength. What was once exploitation becomes knowledge. What was once pain becomes purpose. The empath does not emerge bitter or hardened, but tempered, like steel shaped by fire. They carry within them a light that is not fragile but steady, not naive but enduring. And this light, precisely because it has passed through darkness, shines with a rare clarity. It does not blind, it illuminates. It does not demand, it simply is. The empath, having absorbed the darkness and survived it, becomes something far greater than victim or survivor. They become a living testimony to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the deepest shadow, there is a force within that cannot be extinguished. They become wisdom itself made flesh, love sharpened by truth, sensitivity strengthened by discernment, light born from the heart of darkness.